Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Pioneering Pensions. For you who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg, and I have a passion for pensions. The reason is pension is an important social infrastructure that we all need. And, in older age, it's about getting some financial wellness. We can live a little bit better if we have a good pension. And producing or building a good pension for people requires a lot of different expertise and skill. And the purpose of this webinar series is to get people, to get experts to come here and talk to us about their specific field of expertise. Today, we're going to meet with Annamaria Lusardi, and she's going to talk to us and give us ideas about financial literacy and also financial wellness. So I will introduce Annamaria. She is a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. She's also working with the Italian government to make sure that the education system in Italy actually include financial literacy. And she is also running the Global Finance Literacy Excellence Center at George Washington University. So Annamaria, welcome to Pioneering Pensions.
Thank you, Stefan, and very happy to be here.
I have a first question for you because I did some research and read up on your report, which is called the Personal Finance Index. And I looked at the latest version from last year, work you did together with TIA Institute. I was wondering, can you explain to us and define what is financial literacy and how do we measure it?
Thank you very much. I very much enjoy your presentation, and what I would have to say on my hand is that I am Anna Lusardi and I have a passion for financial literacy. So since 2017, we have started here at GFLAG, the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center, a project with the TIA Institute, which is the research arm of TIA. And we have been measuring financial literacy each year. So we have now 6 waves to see, first of all, how financially literate are Americans, how that financial literacy changes over time, and also look at financial literacy of some specific groups. Now, to your questions, how do you measure it? For the first time, we have a very detailed measure. In the past, I have designed measure of financial literacy, but they were relatively short. In fact, just 3 or 5 questions. In this particular case, we are able to ask as many as 28 questions. Why? Because we want a very detailed measure. In particular, we went and looked at what are, in a sense, the most important financial decisions that people make in their lifetime, and what are the skills and knowledge that are needed to make those decisions. Actually, another way to put it, or methodologically, we look at what are the national standards for financial literacy. If one were to teach a course in financial literacy or personal finance, what would you cover? And these are the topics we cover in the Personal Finance Index. It is called TIA Institute GFLAG Personal Finance Index, or PFIN Index. It's on our website, so everybody can look at the data as you have done. We cover as many as 8 topics. And so they go from consuming, investing, go-to sources of information, managing risk. And we have 3 or 4 questions for each topic. And this is why we get to 28 questions. And we are able to assess, I would say, very granularly, what is the level of financial literacy in the US.
And Annamaria, when I read your report, I also saw you cut the data in different dimensions. So you had one which is basically Black American, Hispanic Americans, and white Americans, but you also look at gender, income, and wealth. When you look at the data from different angles, what was the thing that stood out most to you?
It's a great question, and I want to highlight, and I'm glad you have highlighted this, that one of the things we find is that there is even though financial literacy is very low overall in the population, there are really groups for which this low financial literacy stands out. In other words, there are groups which are particularly vulnerable when it comes to financial literacy. And I want to say that they are disproportionately African Americans and Hispanics. So some of those ethnic minorities display very low level of financial literacy, in particular in some areas which are so important for financial decision making, but also women, the young, and those with low income and low education. So people which are vulnerable in terms of economic, for example, resources, are also vulnerable when it comes to financial literacy. So we think this is a double-edged weakness, or this is an additional maybe challenge that some group face in this always changing world or fast changing world that we need to consider.
And could it be like, if you are a sort of stressed about money and all of that, it also might be difficult to sort of deal with it. You're thinking about it all the time, and when you're then going to go to work, you don't bring your full self to work, and therefore it's much more difficult to get out of this. Is that something you have experienced or seen?
We have experienced this in the data. We ask specifically some questions, for example, about how many hours people spend dealing and thinking about personal finance issues. And we ask actually how many hours per week do they do in total, and how many of those hours are at work. And the number are indeed very large. So we find that on average, people spend 7 hours a week dealing with and worrying about their personal finance issues, and an average of 3 of those hours are at work. But when we look at people with low financial literacy, the number almost double. So on average, 11 hours, people with low financial literacy, very low financial literacy, spend 11 hours a week dealing with personal finance issues, and 6 of these hours are at work. And I mentioned this for 2 reasons. First of all, look at how much time we spend, dealing with our personal finance issue today, because they are so important and consequential. And now some groups are particularly vulnerable, but also I think, this gives us some way to do some back on the envelope calculations. Some people have argued that, financial wellness is a good benefit to give to employees. I actually think it makes economic sense. This doesn't mean that the employer is generous. I think it means that the employer doesn't want people to, in a sense, spend that many hours. It's almost a day of work, dealing and worrying about the personal finance issues. And also we look at measure of anxiety. We ask directly people, whether they suffer from financial anxiety. And yet again, we found that some group really are particularly financially anxious. So something, again, to think about in terms of, how productive people are at work, but also how, happy they are in their life.
Yeah, that's important, because if you worry about something else and instead of focusing on work, it's not good for productivity. It's not good for yourself. One thing that stood out when I read the report, because you said you had these 8 categories you looked into, was that consistently risk always ended up as sort of the category where everybody were sort of weakest. Can you comment a bit on that? Because that sort of drew my attention.
Yes, it drew our attention too. But in this case, I think perhaps we were not surprised, in a sense that this is the finding we have in every other surveys. When we look at the topics that people know the least, risk and risk management, knowledge of risk, always comes out as something that people know the least. And I've experienced this in my classroom as well. When I start discussing risk, this is the topic that students struggle to grasp. This is to say that risk is inherently a difficult concept. Even if you look at the statistics, we say it's the second moment of a distribution. So it's a lot harder to understand risk. And I think, I also want to say, if we have tried to, for example, do a lot of programs, and the programs that are more difficult to design and to implement well are those where we try to explain risk. So there is something inherently difficult. And we see it also that people often struggle with risk. And I think this is an important, and in some cases, it also worrisome finding, given that risk is such an important part of our life. Managing risk is so important. And now more than ever, we need to manage also and be able to face the risk of a pandemic, the risk coming from a war. So, risk is part of our life. And I think it's very important that we understand it and are able to at least manage it, and also are able to diversify some of it.
And I think also when you talk about risk, I given this a lot of thought. And if you talk to someone who has not been brainwashed with modern portfolio theory, they probably think of risk as, I'm going to get a terminal illness, or I'm going to have a bad car accident. My house is burning down. So it's like this. So high impact, low probability event. You don't think of risk as, I'm going to be 5 minutes late to a meeting. And in finance, it's pretty much, we talk about risk, but we don't talk about the really risk, what people think is risk, but something else. So that might also be a way to confuse ordinary people.
It is. And, as you know, a lot of we ask, what are the preferences for people about risk? But the question is, what is it that people are thinking about, when they think about risk? And I agree with you that I think people think about risk as, these extreme cases, or what they really fear. Right? They don't think of risk as this distribution of outcomes, which in some cases you can take advantage of. Right? So, and so, I think it's very important that, we focus a little bit more in try to also teach people about risk, and try to, I think, go beyond this simple measure or the simple question that we have been trying to use. I think this is another lesson we have learned from this data. And as a result, by the way, in my classes, I now put risk at the end of the course. So people have already learned little by little other topics. And we speak a lot about how to manage risk, because it seems to me that's a very important knowledge and skill.
Definitely. I think it's in all walks of life. It's important to understand it. I was thinking about financial wellness. And it has become a buzzword in the industry. Everybody talks about financial wellness. And if you ask 7 people, what is financial wellness? You're going to get 8 answers, to kind of paraphrase the old Keynes joke. But how do you define financial wellness as an expert? So we are writing an academic paper about this. So come back to check the website. Hopefully we will post it soon. But I want to mention what we have done in the context of the PFIN index. Like you have said, we need a criteria to define financial wellness. And what in our case we looked at are the basic models that we are considering when thinking of people choice. So, for example, if you think of the life cycle model, which we think is a very important model to understand saving and financial decision making, what we do infer is that what people want is to smooth consumption over the life cycle. In other words, what people want is to be able to retire, to have a good pension, to be able to face unexpected events, to be able to have choices and not be constrained. And so our measure of financial well-being is capturing, in a sense, those behavior which are really linked to have, a financially secure life. And this is why we look at proxies such as, do people plan for retirement? And in our academic work, we have shown that planning, just the very fact of planning, this might be useful if there are financial planners listening to us, is very strongly linked to wealth and wealth accumulations. Those who plan end up at retirement with a lot more wealth, sometimes 3 times more wealth than those who do not plan. It's also connected with being financially resilient,
which in our case we define as being able to cover an unexpected expense. Being able to manage debt and not accumulate too much debt, because this will create constraints, and also measure of financial anxiety and so on, because this is also linked to the fact that there is something that you have not done properly. So we have designed an indicator of financial well-being, which has several of those proxies, and we think that this can be a good measure, for example, of financial health and financial well-being. And that's what we kind of measure as well in the PFIN index.
And from that, you're saying it's a pretty clear link between those who are financially literate. They tend also to be better off in terms of financial wellness or well-being.
Yeah, so there is a very, very strong link between financial literacy and financial well-being. One can argue, is it a causal link? Does financial literacy causes well-being, or is the other way around? In this data, in a sense, we don't have the type of rigorous information that will be able to, I think, establish a causal link. We don't do an experiment, for example. We ask people, this is a cross-sectional survey, but in other work, we have been able to assess that causality. And so I am, even though, I don't want to claim that the data proves this causality, I think, I'm pretty confident that indeed, in this work, we see the link. And in other papers, we have established that financial literacy gives the skills to people to make better financial decisions.
So you could say, if you would be a provider thinking about this, what you can do about it, you would say financial well-being would actually be give people the tools so they can understand it better and make better informed decisions. Some might actually argue you should not just give them the tool, but you should also give them the product and the app that kind of tells them they should say more and stuff like that, and almost make a product out of it. Why do you think it should be sort of in order to get a good impact?
Yeah, so it's never either or, and certainly while we have studied a lot financial literacy, we don't claim that financial literacy is the only thing that affects behavior. In fact, when you look at choice, and as an academic, I always want to remind people that there are a lot of elements of choice, for which financial literacy is only one. And by the way, I also want to mention that in some cases, in several models, for what is optimal to do for many people is to do nothing, right? So, it's not always the case as we expect that if we give people financial literacy, they should act upon it. Sometimes it's actually best not to do anything. So, I think we have to be careful about this. But the second thing is clearly there are lots of elements in choice. And, as the OECD, or as everybody, even in our financial education committee, we argue, all of these other elements are important. And I think what is critically important is, for example, having good financial products, is having good financial regulation. So every policy, for example, at the national level, every financial literacy policy should go together with good policy for financial regulation, offering good product, having, apps that can help people make decisions. So of course, we need to build a structure that makes it easy to make decisions, and, that is also satisfies the needs of the individuals. So this would be critically important. For that, we need a policymaker, or for that, we need a financial industry. I am an academic. I cannot, design, or I cannot offer a new checking account. And so, as in my hands or on my part, I think it's very important to document where we can help people. And I think it is, important to note, because I don't think this message has, always come through, that if you change the financial knowledge of people, you'll get better outcome. And I'm telling this to policymakers, I'm telling this to the financial industry, I'm telling this to, the individuals as well, because I think, both individual and society can benefit from this increase in knowledge.
And I think one really interesting part is when you look at, for example, a policy that was made about 10 years ago in the UK to start auto enrollment, that everybody has to save for a pension. And most people stay in, whatever they've been auto enrolled into, and they don't make any decision. But if you make that sort of default solution, which is called default choice, if you make that really good, thinking about the whole life cycle, you actually are probably better off doing nothing than doing anything.
Yes and no, I have to say. People are too different to have a one-size-fits-all policy. And I think that's another big suggestion coming from the data. You can set up a default, but this default is only going to be appropriate for a very small group of people. For some, they should save more. For some, they should save much less. And so, what is appropriate for a group, you don't really know. And so I think we have to be careful. I don't think the default should be 0, but I don't think that because we have set a default at 3%, that if people really stick to this 3%, we can declare it a success. It's important, I think, to set up a choice architecture, which is more appropriate to people than maybe, putting them so much on us or making choices. But at the same time, I think people have to make choices because personal finance is really personal. And this is why I think there is a little bit of an advantage of financial literacy over a nudge. A nudge can push people in one direction, but financial literacy cuts across financial decisions. And we don't make only one financial decision, we make many, and they are interrelated. So let me just give you an example, which is very relevant, in particular in the US. Now a young worker has to make a very tough decision, whether to repay student loan or whether to save for retirement, right? So you have to be careful, first of all, how you nudge this person, because if he doesn't pay the student loan, there can be, important consequences. And many young people are not really financially literate, so they might not even, in a sense, make good decision or know which decision to make. But financial literacy will help them manage student loan, will help them manage their retirement account, and will help them make other financial decisions. So I think, it might be more helpful than a simple nudge.
I have actually a question that came in from the last webinar from Richard Fulmer. And instead of me repeating that question, let's roll the tape.
Okay. How can we use financial literacy to nudge people into decisions that are best for them without really trying to add to their complexity and make the choice harder, right? So how can financial literacy help us in that endeavor?
Well, I actually think that that's what financial literacy does. It provides that basic knowledge, and I want to repeat it. We don't want people to become expert, and we don't expect with financial literacy to transform people into little Warren Buffetts, who know what, or are able to price convertible bonds. We just people to know, that you shouldn't put all of your eggs in one basket, what interest compounding is, and that if inflation is high, it's going to, really decrease your purchasing power. So I do think that financial literacy is a good nudge to help people make good financial decisions. It's, the world is very complex. And it has become a lot more complex now. So, to me, financial literacy is equivalent to being able to read and write. You need that basic knowledge today to participate to society. And so I actually do not think you can do it without it. That you need that basic knowledge, and that is going to give you, I think, for example, the confidence also to consult financial advisor. I think people think that financial advice is a substitute for financial literacy, and our research shows it is a complement. People which have higher financial literacy consult financial advisor, not the other way around. So or, it's not the people who don't have financial literacy that, look for advisor. So I do think that, if we could provide that basic knowledge to as many as possible, and particularly the young, we will have a good way to nudge people toward better financial decision for themselves and for society.
And I have a sort of reflection on that, because I read one of your older reports where you looked at financial literacy across the world from 2015. And then Sweden, UK, Netherlands all scored really high in that metric. And I remember about 5 years ago, I did some work for the Swedish government and commissioned research. And they did something similar, and they concluded that Swedes on average are very good when it comes to financial literacy. And then they asked those who selected investment funds themselves, what is important? And everybody knew what was important. Fees important, return is important, risk is important. And at the bottom, they said, well, the name of the provider isn't that important. But in order to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, we also asked them, so what do you remember about the investment choice you made? And say, well, most people remember the provider, which was the least important one, and half of the people didn't know if they have an index fund or not. So even if you know, how do you get people to do? That's my sort of question.
Yes, and if I knew the answer to that question, I would be a millionaire. So, everyone asked me this answer, so I'm not providing it so I can become very rich in the future. But as soon as everybody's searching for that answer. And I want to repeat again that, financial literacy is only one part of this element of choice, right? And so, and in particular, when we look at decision about pension, so coming back to the decision about pension, it is a hard decision. Saving for retirement, know how much to save for retirement, investing for retirement, and accumulating after retirement, are all very difficult decisions. So, we should recognize that. And the fact that people do not act upon some of the knowledge or some of the information as many factors, including the fact that people do not have time, that people are not engaged, that people do not have the confidence to do it. So, we should incorporate all of this. But, if there are people who are communication, for example, expert, I'm actually convinced it's not a communication or a marketing problem. I'm actually convinced that it is also a financial knowledge problem. That like the least I think the least you are going to be engaged, that the least you are going to recognize it's an important topic. And the least the more this decision is complicated, and often you don't even know how to go about it. So, I don't have the answer yet to this $1 million question, but I'll continue looking for it. But I will still bet on the financial literacy card that the more we know, the better we are going to be able to make these decisions, which are inherently very complicated. And as evidence of that, let me just tell you, in our work in Italy, we have seen that as well, that not everybody, and certainly financial literacy is very low among the Italian population, but the one who are more financially literate have also been more active about pension. And by the way, I think there is also now the attention to they understand better changes in the policies related to pensions, and understand that some pension that we all want are not sustainable. And therefore, we need to make painful changes. That's another, I think, reason why we might want to have a population which is more financially literate.
And I think also as a pension or finance industry, we tend to overcomplicate things, almost like this is really difficult. Yeah. You don't try it yourself. And then people sort of think of it's really complicated, while it's actually not if you do have some knowledge. So that might be one thing to think of. I wonder if there's someone in the audience who would like to ask question, because the important part with this webinar is actually to get people the opportunity to ask questions. So please type them in the chat, and we will take them as we go along. There's one question here from David Bird. He says, whose responsibility is it to improve financial capability? And he has a clarification as well. Is it the financial providers, educators, employers, the state, or someone else, for example, an individual? And you're not allowed to say all of the above.
No, of course, right. No, and I don't want an easy way out. But I do think strongly, this is a great question, thank you. I do think that we have a responsibility from the government because there is what is called an externality, or in other words, a spillover effect of financial illiteracy. And we have seen this very clearly with the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. If enough people make bad choices, or if there are problems in their financial decision making, taxpayer will be asked to pay for it. So there is clearly an effect, and that's why many countries, almost all of the OECD countries, for example, have now a national strategy for financial literacy. I think we need to fix this problem, certainly at least, try to promote a little bit more financial literacy, because otherwise I think people might, to make it easy. And having said that, I also want to say, and again, I'm not taking everybody should do it, but if I can use a famous phrase is, people says it takes a village to educate a child, right? And I would say it takes a village to educate a person in financial literacy, meaning, in addition then to the government who can do a national strategy, then, you have to, for example, have financial literacy in the schools, and that's why it takes the government. But the employer, for example, should do financial education in the workplace, because, in the school, you can reach the young and the parents, but you cannot reach everybody. Some people have already left schools. And so to be able to reach all of the population, you also need effort, at the national level and then also at the local level. And I would like to argue that the local level might be even more important.
So to follow up on that one, if you get with financial education, it could be as easy as you get information. If I'm going to take a mortgage, this is the things you should look for. It doesn't mean you go back in school and have a teacher.
Absolutely. In fact, I think, I really wish I could change the word education or financial education and call it something else, because I think people, as soon as they hear financial literacy, they think that, we are going to go back to the classroom, like we are going to sit behind the desk and somebody is going to give us a lecture. Of course not, right? This is not what we mean. And this is why, financial wellness, might be what, we should be using or so on. But, exactly, financial education means, having that knowledge that's important to make the decision. Doesn't mean going back to the classroom.
So ideally, you when you need to make something financially, if you have someone who can give you a friendly, unbiased guidance, that would help a long way.
It would help a long way, but with two clarifications. So first of all, every national strategy, and certainly in Italy, we have designed, for example, a web page where people can go to get all of the information, that type of unbiased, rigorous information that we think is important. So, we want to clearly provide that as well. At the same time, I know that people really like the just-in-time education. And I actually think that just-in-time is too late. If you have decided, if you put your eyes on a house you cannot afford, and because you have not made any calculation, I will not be able to kind of change your mind when you show up, at the bank, right? I mean, you have already envisioned, how you are going to color the walls, of the bedroom. And, so the information right there, I think is not going to help. I think, the information should come before you make the decision, and information should come for you to calculate what you can afford, so that you can go and look at the houses in the neighborhood you can afford, not in the neighborhood, where you are going to have these very beautiful, very expensive houses that your income doesn't allow to buy.
I think that was a very good comment. We have a question from Sarah. It says, we've been working with a charity called Debate Mate that looks at educating children and young adults in areas where there's high child poverty and focusing on finances. And during one of the debates, there was a debate on saving versus spending. And the children came out and say borrowing is a bad thing. So that was a good thing. But because of that, they also were a bit hesitant towards taking student loans, which actually can be an excellent investment. So what do you think we can do to kind of educate young people to actually understand the difference?
Thank you very much. It's a great, great question, which allows me to say two things. First of all, I think it's incredibly important to talk about finance to, in particular, young people, children. I have to say, I have interviewed many people which are very famous, people, for example, which have even created, which are now managing very large mutual funds, or have been even the founder and so on, or people which have, achieved incredible success. And I have noticed that in almost every cases, they always mention that, this interest in finance was, happened to them because somebody talked to them about finance in that early stage of their life. So I think if you want to make a difference in the life of a young person, talk to them about finance. And the reason is, if we don't, first of all, for them, finance could be a reason for anxiety, particularly in a poor society, right? Or in a poor neighborhood, right? You consider finance as, the menacing things, what makes your mom cry, or what makes your family not being able to get at the end of the month. So very important. The other thing is, if we just teach rule of thumbs, right? I've heard so many times finance guru to say, take up no debt, which is clearly not wrong. Every rule of thumb is a very, crude approximation. And clearly, we cannot take the position that every debt is bad. And I think, this is done because we know that debt creates quickly consequences. And we know that is what brings people in trouble. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't take up debt, in particular considering now student loan, and to go to college. Having said that, student loan are very, very important, and we need, to take up the right amount. So, but this is why, we more than ever, we need to teach the young people. Otherwise, I think finance, rather than helping them, is going to be seen as the enemy. Is going to be seen, something that, is inflicting pain in their life, while they should be empowered to kind of try to make the best decision they can, and also try to understand how they can, escape this cycle of poverty.
I think it was a very good recommendation that people who work in the financial industry should actually take the time and go and talk to people, young people, about the advantage of finance to make it less scary and show there is a way to make finance work for you. Great idea. We have a question from Paulina Granados in Chile. And it's, is there any evidence that people with better levels of financial literacy take better decisions related to pensions than people without financial literacy, given a certain pension outcome, for example, monthly pension benefit? And I think, for example, the background here in Chile, you have very big freedom of taking your pension money out. So people tend to eat up their pot very quickly.
Yeah. So I have to say, I've spent probably my entire academic career trying to establish the link between financial literacy and behavior. I've looked at a variety of behavior, not just pensions, but we have also looked at pension. For example, I work a lot with Olivia Mitchell from the Wharton School, and she's one of the, I would say, most important academic that is working on pensions. So, in our work, we have established a causal link between, for example, financial literacy, planning for retirement, investing for retirement, and also insuring. And also now we are looking at carrying debt into retirement. And we would love to see also, and Olivia has already done work about annuities and, for example, behavior after retirement. So I would say the academic research on that, indicates there is a very important and causal link with retirement. And I have also to say, all of the interest on financial literacy, certainly the interest, as we actually, certainly as we started working on this topic, has been originated by pensions. And even around the world, when government set up national strategies, was mostly related to changes in pension. So, even in the mind of the policymaker, there is an important link between financial literacy and pension. And I think now there are other reasons we need to improve financial literacy because, we have other problems in addition to pensions, like student loans and the increase in risk and so on. But, I would say there is clearly a link. And this is why, the pension industry, in my view, should devote a lot of time and resources in trying to empower people to make better decisions. And I think we will all benefit from that.
And also some people argue that actually working longer is probably the best solution, and it's not just a sort of financial decision, because when you're working, you're in a network, you meet other people, you keep yourself going, you have a sort of point in instead of just sitting at home watching telly or whatever you might be doing. So it's a way to keep yourself sharp. Is that also something you should think about, investing in yourself to have your second or third or fourth career when you're getting older?
Well, first of all, this is a great point. First of all, coming back to the story, personal finance is personal. I think now that there is an increase in longevity, right? Indeed, a good strategy is to work longer, but let's remember that not everybody can. And so for two reasons. First, because maybe your health doesn't allow you to do so. And second, because maybe your employer doesn't allow you to do so, or as a lot of incentive for you to exit the workforce. So yet again, I think a lot of the strategies of people for retirement is I'm going to work until I drop dead, and I would recommend not use that strategy, because there can be a lot of obstacle in continuing to work. But I like in particular your second point, and this is what I say to my students. If indeed, young people today are going to live to, 100 or more, clearly, what is ahead of us is going to be very different. First of all, we are going to change many jobs, and this has already been happening. And this is why, we have to, be even smarter in making these decisions. But indeed, in probably at different stages of our life, and not necessarily just close to retirement, people might be, more likely to be self-employed, undertake their own work or so on. So at different stages, this will happen. And even more than before, it's important to have the knowledge and the skills to do so. This also means that, we cannot just follow what the employer is telling us, right? Or what the government is telling us. Maybe the pension that the government is providing is widely inadequate, right, with respect to what I want to do. And the employer, I'm going to stay with the employer 2 years, right? So, it can nudge me, but then I'm going to stay for 2 years, and then I'm going to go to another employer, right? So, that's why in many ways, we have to, put the individual more at the center of this, because, individuals are much more mobile. They live really long. And so, they have to take up a little bit more responsibility. I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, very good. And David Bird again has a question. And this is a sort of UK-centric question, but I think it applies to many countries. It says, what role is right the right one for regulators in financial education. They regulate the firms who are at the point of contact when the consumer are interacting with financial decisions. However, they have a vested interest in the decision. David, good if you clarify what the vested interest would be. But I think the challenge here is basically they put a kind of tight regulation to make sure that no one gets sort of getting a bad advice. On the other hand, means those who are going to actually give an advice or help the client, their hands are tied, so they cannot do it. So you end up in a sort of no man's land. I think that's what David was alluding to.
Yes, I actually think that the role of regulators more and more, and this coming back to Keynes, is to do prevention more than, maybe try to solve the problems when it happens. So Keynes argued that, it would be great if, we do what the dentists do, which is, try to prevent people from going to their office. But I do think that, regulator should have a lot of interest in how people make financial decisions. The way I understood the questions is, when people show up at the, at the meeting with maybe a financial advisor, or when they buy the product, maybe that's an important time to provide information and so on. And in my view, it can be a little too late. So, for example, if you try to simplify information, it can be helpful, but still, some of these decisions are complicated. So people sometimes might need to know more. If you, what is it that you can tell people so that, so they are really informed, so for example, I think MiFID II, you have to have a questionnaire so we understand a lot better the type that you are. Are those things enough? It's not obvious to me, but I think an important role, in my view, of regulators is to make sure that there is an environment which makes it, there is a solid environment, a safe environment for individuals, so that bad products are in a sense weeded out. And kind of to make sure as well that people have that basic knowledge and skills to be able to face, scams, and to be able to understand, the complexity of the product, so that they can also rely on advisor.
I think also what is a challenge, for example, in the UK, is that if you, as a pension fund, if you sort of trying to say this was probably be good for you, they say, that's an advice, and that's regulating. You can get sort of into trouble if you give it, which means that a lot of these sort of common sense advice is not given because the provider is afraid that they end up in legal trouble. So instead of sort of, it kind of prevent people from getting bad advice, but it also prevent people from getting any form of guidance. They're basically left high and dry. So I think that is the trade-off. How do you find a balance there? Because that's, I think, is the key to actually having good financial well-being.
Yeah, it is. And now I understood the question better. But remember, Stefan, there is a very important asymmetric information here, right? So, and the problem is, I think it's difficult and hard to get the information or the advice from the people who are potentially selling you the product or providing, the information. So, again, I am pretty convinced that people, for example, do not want financial advice from credit cards, do not want financial advice from necessarily banks, and because they are afraid of this conflict of interest. Maybe pension funds do not have that problem, and maybe fiduciary responsibility might address some of it. But I actually think that it would be best if education and information is provided by a third independent party, right, of this collaboration, so that this conflict of interest, if there is one, of this asymmetric information is kind of addressed. So it's hard to trust somebody who is going to benefit from the product that is selling you. So,
Yeah, and Annamaria, I would say if you look back in history, there is a reason for people to be a bit worried, given all the mis-selling scandals we have seen. But also in the UK, the government actually tried to install it. They have something called MAPS, Money Advisory and Pension Service or something like that, which is a government entity trying to help people. And most providers signpost people in that direction, but very few people are even going there and contacting them. So even if you have unbiased advice, people doesn't seem to take it.
Again, I want to come back, Stefan, to the fact that the less you know, the less you know what to make of the advice, right? Or the less you are comfortable in making this decision, the more it's an obstacle. So, yet again, I think we need to make sure that, these things are really, and also often people do not make the decision, like it takes a well-educated person to make a decision by going and reading a website, right? I mean, a simple person is going to ask his colleague and friends, which are going to know as much as he or she does, right? So we need, I think, to recognize what are some of the obstacles of people making these decisions and try to address those obstacles. Yet again, we are coming back to the engagement and so on. And it's not easy to engage people in such things, but I am, confident that financial literacy, takes down some of these obstacles, right? Because I think it will make it easier for people to digest the information. It will make it easy for people to understand that, there is a conflict, but perhaps you can address it in some way rather than saying, oh, I'm sure that these people are going to mis-sell. And so, I'm really terrified. And at the end, I don't do anything. So
with the risk of putting words in your mouth, you could say, as a pension fund, you can do financial wellness by actually lifting the level of financial knowledge a bit by, good information rather than boring education. And then hopefully people will feel empowered. So they actually go and take guidance from an independent source. So actually what we best can do is actually help people feel a bit more comfortable about their finance and feel more comfortable about it, take the sort of jargon and financial bullshit out of it, and actually trying to make it accessible, and people will then be stronger, and when they feel stronger they go and take it advice.
And the word I would say is we really need a bottom-up approach. I think many of these approaches have been top-down, meaning we describe what people should do. And that's, I think, is really the wrong approach. We need to start from the bottom, need to realize what are the obstacles that prevent people and try to be there, and try to reduce some of these obstacles. But, it really takes to listen to what are the concerns of the people rather than saying people should, or we know what is good for them. Right. And instead, we want to help people do, put people on the road to financial security, but listen to what are their needs and circumstances.
So Anna, you answered a lot of our questions now. So it's time for you to ask a question. And that's going to be to our next speaker. His name is Nicholas Barr from London School of Economics. And he's been doing a lot of pension design, and he has written a book together with Peter Diamond. And this is sort of the pension Bible everybody goes to when you think about how to do pension policy. He's did a lot of work on student loans as well. So what question would you like to ask Nick?
I'd like to ask him two questions, I have to say, because he's done such an important work. And one is, how can we help and better help young people to save for retirement? Because I think, if I were the Minister of Pension, that's what I would do. I would try to spend a lot of time with the young, because all young have a very important resource, which is time. So how can we best educate the young, because the world is so different for them and their pension is going to be so different. So that's the first question I would like to ask. And related to this is also, how can we change, or what can be done to change the student loan in the US, because in my view, this system, the system that we have in place, doesn't seem to work very well. At 1.7 trillions, this is a very big market, but at the same time, the statistics indicated that, many students, do not know how much they will pay for their student loan when they graduate. If you ask them, if they made any calculation before they took the loan, 50% say they do not. If you ask them if they have regrets, 50% again half say, I wish I had made different decisions, and so on. So there seemed to be, a lot of, in a sense, lack of knowledge, but also a system where, these young people are taking up, now this student loan without knowing a lot about it. And so what can we do so that we empower young people, to take up loan and to be able to pay for them as well?
Thank you, Anna. I will forward that question to Nick. I would say a big thank you to you, Anna, from all of us. It was brilliant to have you here, and you brought valuable insights, and it got me thinking. I have a lot of ideas now what to do. So big thank you. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's been in this webinar, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I welcome you back in a month from now and listen to Nick Barr on April 7 at 2 p.m. UK time. But one more time, Anna, thank you for coming. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It was a pleasure also to participate in this webinar.